goes back to 2016 when the French government published the first national regulation on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure.
Welcome, listeners, to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions, who's going to be introducing for us the subject and guest of our show today. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well. Thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Eric Vautier. He is the Group CISO, Chief Information and Security Officer at Group ADP, which is Aéroports du Paris, the Paris airports, all three of them. And our topic is cybersecurity regulations with a bit of a focus on, of course, NIS2, which is what everyone's doing in Europe.
Then without further ado, here's you and Eric.
Hello, Eric, and welcome to the podcast. Before we get started, can you say a few words for our listeners about yourself and about the good work that you're doing at ADP in Paris?
Hey, hi, Andrew. So my name is Eric Vautier. I'm the Group CISO for Group ADP. So mainly I'm an airport guy. I've done almost all my careers in ADP. I started something like 15 years with airport IT. And then I moved to cyber in 2008. And I started with that because I think it's very important to know the job, to know the company you're in before doing cybersecurity. So I was lucky enough to start with airport IT and then move to cyber within the same company. And in a nutshell, ADP, this is the company operating the three airports around Paris, France, as you can guess from my accent, I guess. So we have CDG, which is international. This is the biggest airport in France, and I think the third one right now in Europe. And something very important also is number 6 as Skytrax quality ratings worldwide. Second airport is Orly, which is mainly domestic and European, so second in France. And last is Le Bourget, which is famous for his air show. And maybe you don't know it, but Le Bourget is the busiest business airport in Europe.
Cool. Thanks for that background. Before we dive into cybersecurity, can we dig a little bit deeper? Can you talk about your airports? Can you talk about automation? I mean, cybersecurity is relevant to, when computers are automating physical processes. I mean, the automation that passengers see at airports is, flight signage. They see ticketing. They see, on their cell phone apps, they sometimes see baggage tracking. Is that it? What happens under the hood at an airport?
No, actually, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, of course. Of course, for us, this is very important for our passengers to have this seamless journey throughout our airports used by modern technology, by IT. But I think, the most critical part to make the airport efficient and operational is under the radar, kind of. And very easily, you can compare an airport like CDG, for instance, to a city. Still taking the example of CDG, we have our own automated train reaching every terminal. We have also water treatment. Of course, you can imagine water on the ramp with pollutants, etc. needs to be dealt with, of course. And last thing, maybe people don't know, we have our own power plant to make sure we have constant electricity. And other than that, you have, like in a city, you have car park management, we have logistics, we call them baggage handling system or BHS for the passenger bags, of course. And this is a key issue for the passengers to have their bags, of course, delivered to the aircraft. And last point, maybe people don't see it like that, but the ramp, the runway, for instance, is kind of similar to a road right now in big airports, in major airports, and you have these kind of traffic lights to allow planes to enter the runway. So really, all this automation is under the radar or under the surface, if I want to stick to the iceberg metaphor.
You mentioned rail. I've visited a metro control center in Spain many years ago. Something like 20 operators sitting in the control center while the metro was running. Each of the operators has 5 or 6 of their own screens, their own keyboard and mouse. They have shared projection screens with a sort of a rendering of the entire system, and where the locomotives are and where the cars are. Is there a control center like that for the airport, or does every bit of the automation, like the baggage, have its own little control center somewhere?
Good question. Actually, we have both. Of course, each system has its own team to make sure it runs smoothly. And but going back, for instance, to the train, our train is only one line, of course, so very simple in comparison to a metro. BHS may be more tricky because, as you know now, BHS embeds X-rays and tomographs, etc. So it's kind of complicated logistic equipment. So, as I mentioned, every system has its own control room, and but of course, and I think your question is very relevant to modern airports. We need someone to get in real time information about all these processes, because at the end of the day, what the passenger wants is to be in the aircraft with his bags, with the catering, etc. So you need to interface or to make sure to coordinate and synchronize all these processes. So we have this trend in airports for some years now called APOC, so Airport Operational Center, kind of big control room for the airport with all the screens, as you mentioned in your metro example. So we are going in this direction definitely for major airports.
You did not mention some systems that I kind of expected you'd talk about at some point. You did not mention the radar, the air traffic control, the interface to what I assume is a nationwide air traffic control. Where does that fit?
Yeah, actually, I think it's my answer will be valid for all Europe. It's more, you mentioned nationwide. Actually, it's European size air traffic control system. Like the name is Eurocontrol, which is a kind of intergovernmental, or I don't know if that's the right word, but trying to coordinate air traffic control all over Europe. And but as you mentioned, for France, this is dedicated to civil aviation, so DGAC, and so they are completely responsible for controlling the aircraft up to the docking point in the airport. The only interface we have with aircraft, kind of saying, is the runway, which is under the responsibility of ADP. But for the rest, talking to the pilot is dedicated to civil aviation.
So, Andrew, now that we're getting started here, I recall it must have been years ago that we spoke with another expert specifically in airport security, right? Do you remember the name of the guest?
I do. That was Mark Lindig. He was the head of cyber defense at Munich Airport. It was a long time ago. That was like episode 12, I believe. And yeah, I dimly recall the episode. Mark I think most of the episode we talked about a new training program that, he and Munich Airport were running for critical infrastructures back in 2019. As far as I know, they're still running it. But what I remember from the episode, what struck me on the episode was, Mark used the same words that Eric is using here. He said, look, Andrew, you're thinking about airports the wrong way. Think of them as a small city. I remember him saying the word small city. Now, the rest of his description, I remember talking about escalators and security cameras and elevators. I remember coming away from the episode, he said the word small city, but I remember thinking of what he described as a large building, because we talked a lot about building automation. But what Eric is talking about today really sounds like a smart city. Their own rail system, their own power plant, their own wastewater treatment, their own water distribution system, their own power distribution system. It really sounds like a smart city. Everything is automated, and everything's going to become more automated because, of course, everyone wants, the experience of going through the airport to be A, more pleasant, and B, cheaper. And that's what automation gives us. It makes everything cheaper.
Building off that to the theme of this episode, regulation seems like a pretty important, or at least maybe ever-present thing when you have such a structure as you're describing, right?
It does, and Eric's going to get into this, but very briefly, there are differences between smart cities and airports, and there are enormous similarities. The differences, to me, are, in a sense, obvious. You have a huge physical security focus and, of course, regulations in airports. You have security lines, you have X-ray machines. And I assume, there are regulations for all this. You don't tend to see, regulations for X-ray machines in smart cities. But the similarities are obvious. Smart cities have all sorts of regulations either in place or coming into place for critical infrastructures. Airports are critical infrastructures, and they're small cities. So, yeah, we are seeing a lot of similarities there as well. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. I mean, our topic is regulation and eventually cybersecurity regulation and this too. But, can we start with the big picture of regulation? What does the regulatory environment look like for an airport in France?
Yeah, actually, nowadays it's quite a complex environment because we have so many different regulation coming from different origins. So we have first critical infrastructure regulation. So national one, national regulation first, and then it became the NIS 1 regulation. So we're still under these two in France. And on top of that, we have also sectorial regulations, aviation ones, of course, here, and one with dealing with physical security in airports. And the second one, of course, and it's very important for our passengers, is safety regulation under the umbrella of ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. So this is for Europe, but I think it's quite similar to the US, where you have different entities also regulating, like TSA, FAA, and I guess CISA or CISA. And so this is it, actually, kind of multiple layers dealing with similar topics.
So complexity, and our focus here is cybersecurity. Can you tell us a bit about sort of the big picture of cybersecurity in France, and eventually, how it starts applying to airports?
It goes back to actually 2016 when the French government published the first national regulation on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. It has been a 3 years work in discussion with the cybersecurity agency. And eventually in 2016, we had this first regulation asking critical infrastructure operators to fulfill quite a number of requirements. So it started there. 2 years later, we had kind of similar regulation at European level called NIS, Network and Information Security Directive. So now it's NIS 1 because we have this NIS 2 on the horizon. And then later on, we had to implement regulation around, as I mentioned before, sectorial. And the first one was physical security under the responsibility of DG Move, part of EU, of course. And next year, or at the end of the year or next year, we will have a regulation on safety published by EASA, which is a European Agency for Safety in Aviation.
Let me start with ANSI. I saw the regulation come out in 2016. I was impressed. I mean, it's 2 volumes. And to me, it was surprisingly readable. It is, I think, the most understandable regulation in the world for critical infrastructure cybersecurity. I recommend our listeners look it up and read it. search for classification method and detailed measures, ANSI, ANSSI. But let me ask you, when that came out, the regulation seemed, in my read of the prologue to the regulation, it seemed to me to apply sort of once. You did an audit once when a new system was created. It didn't really apply retrospectively to existing systems. I understand that NIS, demanded that France, or that all member nations, create regulations that I thought were sort of ongoing, that sort of had a permanent effect rather than a one-time audit requirement. Can you talk about, where did ANSI start and how did NIST change it? And is that still where it is today? How did we get where we are today?
Yeah, it's a very long story, so I try to resume it at best. So I agree with you about the clarity of this regulation. If I may pay a tribute to ANSI there, I think it's worth it. First, they didn't publish this regulation without consulting different sectors. That's the way we organize for critical infrastructure in France. We have something like 18 sectors, critical sectors, and within that, of course, it depending on different ministry. And they started to discuss with us. So main operators, like for instance in aviation, like Air France, ATC, so DGAC, and ADP, for instance, because they had their own ideas, but they wanted to make sure that these ideas were applicable in real life. So it took something like 3 years of discussion. Of course, ANSI had his own goal, and so they managed to publish this kind of joint result, if I may say so. Of course, 95% is ANSI, and 5% maybe is due to conversation with operators. So it started like that, but I will slightly contradict you. It's for each and every system. And we had at the time 3 years for old system to comply with the regulation, which is very extensive, as you mentioned. I encourage also people to read it. And it was also kind of the beginning of cybersecurity by design in regulation. So the new system you mentioned, you're exactly right. They are supposed to be secured when they enter, when they are implemented, operationally implemented. But we had to go back to the old systems and make them also compliant with all regulations. That's the kickstart in France, if I may say so. And 2 years later, we have this NIS directive, and honestly, it was promoted and maybe a bit driven by France at the time at EU level. For I guess, and maybe I'm wrong, but I guess because we already had in France this experience, or ANSI had this experience of creating the text. So if you look at it, NIS 1 and French regulation are very similar, and it was also very clever from ANSI, if I may say so once again, because it means that for critical operators in France, we were already compliant to NIS 1 if we were compliant with the French regulation. That's how it all started. Yeah.
I am still confused. NIS, I thought, was a directive from the European Union to the member nations, saying the member nations have to produce regulations. So the directive was not regulations by itself. ANSI already had these regulations that mandated an audit at the beginning of life for a new system. But I thought the NIS directive said the regulation has to be sort of more than one audit. I kind of missed how did NIS, is there more to ANSI? Is there another document that people like me should be looking at, saying, oh, here's the sort of the current world of NIS in addition to the original ANSI?
Good question. Maybe I was too quick or not precise enough. Yeah, you're right. A directive in European sense means that every member state has to transpose it into its own regulation. So what ANSI did very easily, they said, okay, we already have our own regulation and it fits to the requirement of the directive. So they kind of transpose it. So you have, you're right, a specific text, which is a NIS directive transposition in French regulation, which is, I would say, almost exactly, because maybe some words are different, but almost exactly the regulation we already had in place in France for critical infrastructure. So they are it's really perfectly aligned, if I may say so.
Let me ask you, you mentioned earlier cybersecurity rules for safety systems, cybersecurity rules for physical security systems. NIS was sort of history by now. NIS 2 is coming. You've got safety, you've got physical security. Can you talk a bit more about sort of the modern regulatory environment and what you're facing today?
It's quite similar. We still have the same players in place, and I think we can stick to the European level because it's valid for France. We still have the three origin of text. So I mentioned EASA for safety, I mentioned DG Move for security, and NIS2 is under DG Connect, which is kind of IT ministry for Europe. And this last one is for each and every sector of the economy. And the two other ones are really dedicated to aviation. So the difficulty for us is that these texts don't really align, and they have some different requirements depending. So of course, depending on the topic, of course we have a large share of commonalities, kind of actual cybersecurity. But we have slightly different requirements. For instance, on safety, they are applying their safety regulation for, I would say, everyday safety regulations. And for instance, when you investigate an accident, aviation accident, you need to keep track of something like 5 or more, even more data on the equipment. So they just transpose it to cybersecurity and said, if you have a cyber incident, you need to keep 5 years of records. And I'm sure your listener will find this very important, maybe too much. Maybe we think something similar. But so you see that they didn't try to understand what would be the implications of saying, yeah, just give us 5 years of records. And things like that. And risk analysis is slightly different depending on the regulation. So same thing. How do we conduct a risk analysis for EASA, for DG Move, for DG Connect? And so that's really the tricky part of it. Making sure we don't duplicate our work just to prove something we do once. And so. Especially airports, we have been advocating for this during the rule-making task of this regulation, saying you need to align, you need to kind of overlap your regulation and don't do specifics in your own track.
Imagine that you work in a power plant. You're responsible for a half dozen massive boilers. If a cyber attack makes one of these boilers overpressurize and explode, that explosion will most likely kill you. Which protection from that cyber attack would you prefer? Would you like a mechanical relief valve, one that steam pressure forces open when the pressure gets too high so the steam is released harmlessly? Or would you rather have a longer password on the PLC controlling the boilers? The engineering profession has powerful tools to address physical risk from all causes, including cyber risks. But where is the relief valve in the ISO standard or the Industrial 62443 standard? These engineering tools do not exist in cybersecurity standards. Andrew Ginter's latest book, Engineering Grade OT Security, A Manager's Guide, looks at this topic. You can request your free copy at waterfall-security.com engineering-grade-OT-security.
So, Nate, Eric did not say the word, but the word I hear used in lots of other contexts, talking about this issue is harmonization. Owners and operators are talking about it. Government authorities are talking about it. Manufacturers of, automation and security equipment are talking about it. And it's, we're seeing more and more cybersecurity regulations. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, there was almost nothing. There was NERC-CIP. There was CFATS, which, was Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism in North America, had, like 3 paragraphs on cybersecurity. There was almost nothing. Today, there's NERC-CIP, there's NIST-2, there's the original NIST, there's, every country has some kind of critical infrastructure cybersecurity, and often in different regimes, for airport safety, for, the safety of water treatment systems. Every sort of authority has their own cybersecurity standard. And so everyone is saying, look, if I have to do a cyber risk assessment for 6 different agencies, according to 6 different rules, do you know how much effort that is to cross all those T's and dot all those I's? Can't you guys sort of harmonize? Can't you normalize these things? So I only need to do one cyber risk assessment to sort of one uber global set of rules, and be done with it. And it's not just risk assessments. There's risk assessments, there's audits. Different authorities coming in every 2 months, a different authority drops in on you to do an audit. At the end of the year, you repeat. It costs too much. Incident reports. Lots of different authorities are requiring incident reports. If you've got a multinational that operates critical infrastructure in multiple countries or in multiple continents, and there's a cyber incident at this owner and operator somewhere, how many different authorities do they have to report it to? How many different formats do those reports have to take? How many different kinds of detail do those reports have to supply? Manufacturers, it's not just owners and operators. Manufacturers are complaining about the same thing, saying, look, increasingly, in different jurisdictions, they're required to report vulnerabilities to different authorities, sometimes in confidence, sometimes in public, with different levels of information. Again, they're saying, can we not all get on the same page, people? Do you have any idea how much paperwork burden you're imposing on operators and manufacturers? And it's not just Europe, it's not just NIST-2. I hear these issues arising in North America. I hear them all over the world. Any time that you have multiple authorities, anytime that you have multinational corporations operating in lots of different jurisdictions, you have these harmonization problems. This is sort of a hot topic, hopefully for the next 3-4 years, until it all gets sorted out. Cross our fingers. So pulling it all together, the big news in Europe is NIST-2. It is again a directive to the member nations. And in my experience, there is widespread interest in NIST-2. We're talking airports here, but when I attend security events in Europe, when I interact with customers or prospective customers in Europe, everyone talks about NIST-2. How big an impact has NIST-2 been for the airport? Because you've been sort of critical infrastructure from the beginning. How big has it been? How big will it be for the airport?
It depends on the side, actually. Yeah, you're right. NIST-2 is a very big thing in Europe right now because its coverage is much larger than the previous regulations. For instance, in France right now, we have something like 250, 300 critical infrastructures operators. With NIST-2, the estimate, because today nobody can really say, but the estimate is 15,000 companies. So you see the difference between the two as far as coverage is concerned. This is the first change. Second change also for the size of it or the width of it is the number of sectors. They want to extend it to sectors that were not under the previous regulations. So once again, more companies, more operators. And going back to your question specifically on airports, for ADP it won't change anything. And I think for major airports throughout Europe, it will be the same thing. But with NIS2, all airports, when you read the text, but we need to wait for official lists, but when you read the text, you may guess that all airports, big or small, will be under NIS2. And this is a big issue, of course, for small airports that may don't have the teams right now, may don't have the cybersecurity in place exactly like major airports have. So I think this is really what's the main concern for people in Europe. I would say small companies more than big companies that are already doing a lot on cybersecurity.
Okay, so it makes sense that in a nation that had ANSI almost 10 years ago, and it was, like I said, it was very well done in my opinion. That the largest airports aren't going to see much change. Are you going to see any change? I mean, it seems to me that the world has changed in the last 10 years, cybersecurity wise. What kind of changes do you see coming, if any?
Yeah, I said big airports won't see the difference internally, if I may add, but I think we will see a major difference on outside. And when I say outside, I mean the supply chain. It was the main critics we had at the time of NIS1, saying that all requirements were on the operator. And as you know, and especially airports, no one is really alone doing his job. And we have in airports quite a number of suppliers, IT, OT, whatever. And these suppliers were outside of this NIS1 directive. So this is something that has changed and is very important, meaning that these supply chain companies, they will also have requirements being kind of indirectly part of critical infrastructure. Just to give you an example, I mentioned previously cybersecurity in physical security. If you're a passenger, you have put your bags in X-rays, very easy to spot. And this X-rays right now is tomography plus a computer. So of course we have cybersecurity questions around it. And on this one, we could just add send question to this manufacturer saying, please be gentle and add some cybersecurity. Now with NIS2, they fall under it. So they can't say this is the airport problem, but it's also their own problem now, and they will have to fulfill this requirement too.
So coming back to something you said a moment ago, 15,000 entities, lots of smaller airports. The smallest entities don't have a lot of money to spend on cybersecurity. The smallest nations don't have a lot of money to spend, defining regulations, much less enforcing them on smaller entities. Does NIS2 address that? I mean, if there's going to be that many entities and that many people, getting paid to do cybersecurity, on the one hand, that's a lot of money. On the other hand, saying, we don't have the money, it costs too much, doesn't make the threat go away. How do you balance security and cost in NIS2?
Good question. I think there have been a lot of discussion around this topic, and for instance, the Association of European Airports has been advocating for kind of exemption for very small airports. But actually, small airports, they don't have a lot of IT, OT, and if they have, the consequence of a failure maybe not as important as in the big one, where you have this optimization, as we mentioned before. Thanks to IT and OT automations. But I think cybersecurity maybe is a proportional issue. You depending on your size, you put kind of proportional amount of money. For instance, if you want to secure a small system, you want to have so many equipment, cybersecurity equipment. You will have something which is quite fitted to the side of the airport, and a bigger airport like ADP will spend a lot of money because we have a lot of systems. But when you have smaller systems and in a limited number, I guess this is kind of the same amount of money. You said security costs too much. I have a kind of a saying, which is maybe it costs, but lack of security may cost more, even more, if someone finds you and destroy or damage your system. So I think this is something which is, of course, this is interpretation, but I think it's something in NIS2. I think the right word may be adequate level of cybersecurity, meaning that you need to assess your system, assess the cybersecurity risk on this system, and put the adequate measure or controls to reduce that risk. So, of course, it will change things for smaller companies. They will have to hire people and put some equipment in place if they don't have already, they didn't do it already. But I think it's not, of course, it is when you spend nothing, spending something is a big deal, but at the end of the day, I don't think this is such a big deal in comparison to the impact and the consequence a lack of security may have.
Andrew, if I could bring us back to small airports for a moment, there's something timeless in, small organizations not necessarily having all of the budget that large ones do to deal with cybersecurity, but of course, not having security and then having an incident ends up being much more expensive in the end. So what exactly are we proposing that small airports in this kind of situation do to keep up?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a question that is confusing to a lot of practitioners. I think part of the answer is what Eric said, which is, look, the smaller airports tend to be automated less. They tend to have less automation, therefore they have less exposure on the OT side, on the industrial side, to cybersecurity attacks, and so they need less security. So that's a good thing. It means you don't have to spend an ADP size budget on cybersecurity for a small airport's OT systems. But what it also means, it's a question of economies. I mean, why do we deploy OT automation? Why do we deploy computers there at all? It's to save money. And what we have to be careful of in small airports is when we look at our existing automation, when we look at new automation opportunities, it's important that we look not, don't just say, hey, I could spend $100,000 and save $150,000 over the course of 3 years. That's a $50,000 benefit. Here we go. You have to say, I could spend $100,000 on a new system, new automation. And how much more cybersecurity would I need? You've got to include the cost of securing your new automation. You can't just, if you've got something that is sort of automation that is marginally beneficial, it's going to save, $50,000 over 3 years on a $100,000 investment. To me, that's marginal. If you had a $100,000 investment that would save you $600,000 over 3 years, well, then you can afford to spend $100,000 of your savings on a proper cybersecurity system for that new piece of automation. But if your payback is marginal, really we probably shouldn't be deploying that automation. We need to be deploying automation where the payback is big enough to provide protection from the new risks that we're introducing. This is the thing that confuses a lot of practitioners, and that I think is going to become very crystal clear for small operators in the years ahead. We're coming up on the end of our interview here. Let me ask you, we've been talking about sort of the history of cybersecurity in the aviation industry in France and in Europe. We've been talking about the present, which is NIS2. You folks at the Paris airports, you personally have been working with authorities, with French and European authorities on cybersecurity for a very long time now. And this too is something that is sort of the current big news. But you're talking to these authorities. Can you look into the future for us a little bit? What are you working on now? What are we going to see coming out in the next year or two or three?
Yeah, I can't really say, so I will guess, and I hope when we get back to this interview in 3 years' time, maybe it will be still valid. I don't know. But I think there are some fields that are not really covered. This is continuous improvement loops, these regulations, and for instance, right now NIS2 is generic to every sector, so they don't go into details. I mentioned things we have in aviation, for instance, but once again, this is not detailed enough, I would say, or detailed for the operator. For instance, in airport, I mentioned safety and security. So we are supposed to do our homework on this topic, but they don't say exactly what we need to do to secure a safety system, for instance. So I guess with experience, with return of experience from operators and maybe some incidents, maybe they start defining more precise regulations, like maybe they have in nuclear and maybe sometime in rails also, as far as I know. So maybe it will be a kind of drilled down by sectors. So I don't know, for instance, for pharmaceutical or food industry, I don't know if that's something specific that is not detailed enough in the under NIS2. That's maybe one topic. Another topic, maybe especially for aviation, but maybe it's similar to other sectors, is the notion of ecosystem. Right now, the regulation focused on operators. So ADP has to be compliant on his own. But of course, ADP without an airline, without air traffic control, without aircraft manufacturers, we are useless. So this ecosystem as a whole needs to be secured also by design. So we are very at the early stage right now. We are kind of sequencing. The airport does this, the airline does that, etc. EASA, I mentioned before, tried to do that, to work as an ecosystem and share the risk analysis, for instance, is in the text. But I think, once again, this is only the early stage. And I think later we will need to reach that ecosystem cybersecurity by design. And last point, which is not much of a prediction because it's already in place, we have a new text in Europe called Cyber Resilience Act, which is defining what we should put in place to be resilient. I know this is a kind of gimmick right now, but meaning we are doing a lot in prevention with NIS2, and in case we have an incident, how do we react? This is resilience to me, more than business continuity. And so we have also this kind of new topic, I would say, as far as regulation is concerned. And I think we'll have also a lot of work to do to be able to recover as quickly as possible in case of a dramatic incident.
So something that I've been thinking about that occurs to me, thinking about the interview so far, 15,000 entities, that's a lot, just in France, that's a lot of entities to audit. If you audit every 3 years, that's a lot of auditors. How's that going to work?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, Andrew. Actually, you should ask Ansi about this. But for me, and once again, this is my interpretation. I think it shows the way. It shows the way the regulators want to proceed now. Before NIS2, let's say NIS1, and sorry for the technical terms, it was a kind of ex ante. This is Latin. Sorry for that. We're in France. This is an ex ante regulation, meaning that the regulators can come to you and said, prove you've done what's in the regulation, the requirements of the regulation. With a number of companies, as you mentioned, I think it will be ex post regulation, meaning that, and you were right, ANSI won't be able to go to each and every company, but let's put it like that, they will go after you if you have an incident, and you will have to prove that you implemented the regulation as best as you could. Of course, it's cybersecurity. It's not an exact topic. We still have space for interpretation. But I think if you are not able to prove you did your best, then you have a problem. And especially something quite strange at the beginning, but the first articles of the regulation mention the responsibility of the top management. And one article says, I don't know if it will be applied one day, that they can remove the CEO or the top management team if they prove unable to deliver cybersecurity. So I'm pretty sure that for some operators could be the case. And if you have an incident, good luck with that, because they will come with the text and maybe use this article.
Let me cover that ground again. I'm not quite sure this is what Eric said, but what I heard was an interesting idea, whether he meant it or not. What I heard was, look, there's a problem of audits. I mean, that was the question I asked. Do the math. If there's 15,000 organizations that need to be audited every 3 years, that's 5,000 organizations a year. If an audit takes, I don't know, a week or 10 days on site and another week or 10 days of writing up after the fact, we're talking, practically speaking, one audit per month per auditor. If we have 5,000 person months of audits to do every year, you've got to hire, something like 600 auditors plus their managers and their infrastructure. We're talking, 6 or 7 or 800 hires on the part of the regulator. That's a lot of money. But what I heard was, look, in the past, the big fish, sort of covered by the original NIST directive and the original ANSI directives, the big fish, yeah, you want to do thorough audits on them because they're big fish, they're critical infrastructure. We care a lot about their cybersecurity. If you've got a lot of smaller airports and, smaller entities, that you need to audit, do you really need to do a really thorough audit on every one of them? Are they all equally important? And the answer may be no. You can probably do a less thorough audit. You can burn through these organizations, these smaller entities, faster. So do that. Don't hire quite as many people. But what happens if there's an incident? After the fact, it makes sense that you're going to do a deep dive on cybersecurity at the affected organization. There may be consequences for the affected organization. It's going to be a public process, is my guess. You can publish learnings and best practices to the entire industry, all other smaller players, when you have these incidents. So the concept that the regulator might say, we're going to do a deep dive on a small entity when those entities are breached. That, if I heard it right, I haven't heard anyone else, talk about that. That strikes me as an interesting approach and something that probably the regulator could sort of do on their own. It doesn't have to be specified in the regulation. This can just be a practical way of dealing with it. So that's something to think about. That's, to me, that was an interesting takeaway. There's a lot of ground that we covered here. What are the big takeaways? What, if you wanted to summarize what's going on and sort of give people a lesson going forward? What should we learn from this space?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to say so. I'm just a CISO in an operator, but things maybe that could be useful to your listeners. First is regulation is not going away. So if you think you can avoid it because you're too small, or maybe you're in the right within brackets, you're in the right sector, meaning not covered by regulation, forget about it. Actually, when you look at the regulation, it's not rocket science. It's just asking you to do everyday cybersecurity. But but make sure you do it actually. And more importantly, I think when you have regulation, it is something I've observed in ADP for more than 10 years now. When you have regulation, you have the attention of your CEO or your top management. So for CISO in the room, I think use the regulation wisely to get you budget and interest and raise awareness within your company. And maybe for CEO, I don't know if some are listening now. I think one important thing is cybersecurity is not a technical topic. Actually, it's a cultural one. I mean culture in companies, but also culture in everyday society. Everybody now has his own smartphone, I guess, and this is IT. So you need to understand what cybersecurity for your smartphone as well as cybersecurity for your OT system in your factory. And I think that's, in a nutshell, very high level, what NIS2 is trying to implement. Do everyday cybersecurity because it's protecting your critical assets and help you deliver the service you promise to deliver. That's maybe two things I want to address to people doing it. And last topic is for suppliers. I mentioned the supply chain before, and I've only 3 words for them. It's cybersecurity by design, please. With NIS1, as I mentioned, we have been fighting with some equipment manufacturer saying, this is our obligation now. So please help us reach that. Now with NIS2, it's their obligation too. But once again, this is no longer an extra for an equipment. It needs to be secured by design. So pay attention to this regulation. It will help your customer, and you will also help your company to be as competitive as needed. So that would be my 3 takeaways for NIS2.
You know, Andrew, I feel like this happens sometimes where we start an episode with a certain topic and then we just end up talking about NIS2 a lot.
Yeah, NIS2 is a very big deal in Europe. But to be fair, regulation is increasing in a lot of places. In the USA, for example, the TSA has issued a cybersecurity directive to airports as well. That said, for now, the directive is confidential. I mean, I'm assuming the directive looks a lot like to their rail and pipeline directives, but I don't know that for sure. So, regulations are increasing in a lot of places. And I mean, there's a truism in the industry, in the cybersecurity industry, never waste a crisis. Nobody wants a crisis. Nobody wants their OT systems to be breached and, fires to start and people to be injured. Nobody wants any of that. But if you have a crisis, never waste the crisis. Use the crisis to spring some money loose. Money to solve the cybersecurity problem that you knew from the beginning needed to be solved. The same thing with regulation. Nobody wants regulation. But if you have a regulation coming down on you, don't waste the opportunity. Use the opportunity of the regulation. Use it to spring some money loose. And yes, do the paperwork to comply with the regulation and make the changes that you knew needed to be made in terms of technology, people, process. Solve the problem in addition to dealing with the regulation. And yeah, NIS2 is affecting tens of thousands of organizations all throughout Europe. Enormous change in terms of societal expectations, enormous interest. So yeah, never waste a crisis, never waste a regulation.
It makes sense to me. With that thought, thank you to Eric Vautier for speaking with us. And Andrew, as always, thank you for speaking with me.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thank you to everybody out there listening.